A Little More Phi Alpha Pi by Sara Marks. 21st Century Austen 2.5. A short story collection and companion to Pride, Prejudice, and Pledging. In the years since I originally published this story collection, I have grown accustomed to some of these characters walking into my brain and taking over for a short time. Well, after I thought I was done with the sorority sisters of Phi Alpha Pi, I can't seem to shake them. To the extent that, as I wrote the first draft of a second modernization of Pride and Prejudice, Sweeten Up Ginny Darcy comes out in May 2023, these characters kept coming back. There were nights I would lay in bed, listening to my music and trying to fall asleep. Suddenly, Caroline would come and tell me about her life after the story. There would be afternoons, while watching a movie or walking the dog, that Lydia or Marie would come and tell me their opinion on the plot or characters. I present an updated edition of this short story collection with new stories that were published after I originally released the book. Some stories happened easily. I knew how the characters in Phi Alpha Pi connected to those in Modern Persuasion. Read Everyone Wants a Cookbook for that. Emma Shaw is Layla's, Lisbeth's mother, publisher and wants to publish Jack's cookbook. It gave me a chance to explore Lisbeth's brother and sister a little more. Some came from a desire to build a universe around cock jokes and a theme park that I could layer into all my writing if necessary. See Year of the Rooster. Then there was my own desire to go back to Paris, which led me to write a story about how Will would eventually propose to Lisbeth. See Je t'aime, Monsieur Darcy. I've added in more of Lydia's story with I Just Want to Help, which was originally published in A Little More Woodhouse Hall. It reveals what happened when Lydia transferred to Lacroix State to finally finish her degree. Then, in Open to Negotiation, we find a confident, adult Lydia who is ready for love. There is Dinner at Beacon and Charlie's, which was originally in A Little More Northanger Parks that briefly mentions Lisbeth's father Jack, who worked with Northanger Parks to organize a personalized dining experience for park guests. I hope you enjoy it as much as you enjoyed Pride, Prejudice, and Pledging, previously Phi Alpha Pi, and that it helps you understand more of how all these books are connected. Sara. How to Act Like an Alpha by Sara Marks. A prequel story to Pride, Prejudice, and Pledging. 21st Century Austen Book 2.5. I have a confession, Jane said as they got to the door of their favorite pizza place. You didn't lure me away from midterms for pizza and guy talk? Shocking. Lisbeth said. I'm serious, Lisbeth, this is an emergency, and I need you to be open to a new idea. Jane had been anxious about something for a couple of days. Ever since they got back from the sorority meeting on Sunday night, she had been pacing rooms and making sure Lisbeth heard deep sighs of frustration. Now it was Wednesday, and this was the most passive-aggressive Jane had ever been in her entire life. Lisbeth was fascinated and letting it go unacknowledged just to see if Jane would have a blow-up from the pressure. Charlotte had even started asking Lisbeth to wager on what Jane would do next. Lisbeth had agreed to go out for pizza only to see if Jane would finally break. Now Lisbeth looked in the large windows of the pizza shop and saw Gia, her sorority big sister, sitting at the table with Mandy, the current Phi Alpha Pi president. Lisbeth realized precisely what this was about. At Sunday's meeting, sophomore Lydia had announced her intention to run for sorority president next year. The entire room had been split on this, and both Gia and Mandy had clearly been unhappy. Lydia had been the main reason they had been on academic probation all year. Lisbeth hadn't cared about it until January when Jane asked for help. Lisbeth and Charlotte had only joined the sorority to hang out with Jane, but it was Jane who was most involved. In September, when Mandy had informed all the sisters that they had the year to get off academic probation, she had also assumed this would spur them all to action. She assumed they would focus on studying. That hadn't happened, and it was Lydia who had the worst GPA and encouraged many other sisters to ignore the probation requirements. The other worst offender had been the former sorority secretary Heather, who had been kicked out of school for repeated probations of her own. Jane had picked up secretary duties in January and begged Lisbeth to help the sisters develop better study habits. It had worked. On Sunday, it had been announced that they would be removed from probation after finals, no longer at risk of being kicked off campus and closed to new members. Lisbeth followed Jane to the table where Gia and Mandy sat. "We ordered Lisbeth's favorite," Gia said when they sat down. "Pepperoni and onion?" Jane asked. "Of course." Lisbeth rolled her eyes, making sure Gia saw her. "Please, Lisbeth, hear us out before you dismiss the idea," Jane begged, practically whining. Lisbeth said nothing as they sat down, and Gia seemed to understand the message. "We can't let Lydia get elected president," Gia said. "You know she'll get the sorority kicked off campus, and the alumni will murder us if we let that happen." "Really?" Lisbeth asked. "Isn't that a little melodramatic?" "Murder? You don't disagree about Lydia, then?" Mandy said. Lisbeth shook her head. "Right, then let's not beat around the bush." This was something Lisbeth liked about Mandy. She was direct and honest, seems to be allergic to bullshit. "Agreed," Lisbeth said, not wanting to torture Jane anymore. "We want you to run for president." "Why not Jane?" Lisbeth asked. Jane vigorously shook her head. "I don't want to be president, but if you do it, then I'll be your membership VP." Lisbeth looked at her best friend and considered the proposition. "Why me? I haven't been that active and a lot of the sisters don't even know me." "That's why you're perfect," Gia said. "You don't have baggage, and you stepped up once already. You're the reason we're getting off probation." "You're an alpha," Mandy said. "You push back when people try to force you to do anything you don't want to do." "That's bold of you to say, considering you're trying to convince me to do something I don't want to do." "I think you secretly want to do this," Jane said quietly. Lisbeth turned and looked at the one woman at the table who really knew her. "Why do you say that?" "It didn't take a lot to convince you to start running the study groups and do organization workshops." "Jane's right," Gia said. "You were all too happy to do that." Lisbeth chuckled, remembering the request for her help and how quickly she had agreed. "Yes, but I know how to do that. I don't know anything about running a sorority." "I'll help you," Jane said. "I've been paying attention. The sorority does leadership training for new officers. This happens more often than you'd expect. They pay for your entire trip and will run webinars during the year. You just have to say yes," Mandy clarified. "Help me, Obi-Wan, you're my only help," Gia said with a dry laugh. Lisbeth looked at her big sister. "While I certainly appreciate the comparison, I don't think I can do it. I have so much already going on next year. The thesis, applying to graduate schools, and who knows what else. Plus, I don't think I want to live in a dorm-style situation again. I don't think I've ever shared an actual bedroom." "What if Marie helped us?" Jane asked. Lisbeth considered her own little sister, who was a stickler for rules and keeping things in order. Lisbeth had often wondered about Marie's reasons for joining a sorority. She didn't fit any sorority girl stereotype. "How?" "If you say yes, she's agreed to be secretary. What about Charlotte? Lisbeth asked. Considering the way she laughed at the idea when I asked her in January, I didn't even bother asking her, Gia said. Lisbeth looked at Jane. Promise me you won't desert me in the middle of this. I promise, you know how much this means to me. Lisbeth laughed. Jane loved their sorority and would never abandon her sisters. That was at the heart of who Jane was. I thought your head was going to explode. Does that mean yes? Mandy asked. Lisbeth rolled her eyes again, for good measure. Fine. How did it go? Charlotte asked when Lisbeth and Jane got back from dinner. She said yes. Jane said with a sigh so deep, Lisbeth half expected her to collapse. Then I should tell you something I learned today. What? Jane asked, looking panicked again. Lydia won't be put down that easily. We've lined it up. I know, Lisbeth is president, you're doing membership, and Marie is secretary. What about events? You know that's what she really wants. Did someone tell you something? Lisbeth asked. I was at the house today, and I overheard something. I don't think Lydia knew I was listening, but she's shitty at being quiet. She's positive Gia and Mandy were trying to find someone to challenge her. Does she know it's Lisbeth? Jane asked. She didn't say, but she might not know yet. She made it clear she would just steamroll her agenda and parties onto the calendar. Lisbeth looked back at Jane, hoping she would have an answer. What? You can handle Lydia. Just do what you do to every other freaking bully you meet. What's that exactly? Lisbeth asked. Out-alpha them. Jane said and collapsed onto the couch in a fit of giggles. Did you break Jane at dinner? What does that even mean? Charlotte asked. Apparently, I'm the alpha in a pack, Lisbeth said with a shrug. Charlotte threw her head back and laughed. Oh, yeah, that's absolutely true, she said when the laughter subsided. Am I really? I always thought I was just driven. Yes, and single-minded, and you don't back down when you're sure you're right. Lydia has nothing on you. You're what she wants to be, Jane said. But she doesn't know you well enough to realize that. You, on the other hand, know exactly who she is and how to get her to back down. Lisbeth thought back to her few interactions with Lydia. She always seemed like a hyperactive, energetic puppy. Lisbeth recalled that the younger woman was also a fantastic planner but only applied the skills to party planning and not schoolwork. What if I nominate her for the event planning VP? Lisbeth asked her friends. Both of them got quiet. That just might work, Jane eventually said. Can't hurt, Charlotte agreed. We've successfully elected a new president, Mandy said, coming back into the room with the election committee. Lisbeth, Charlotte, and Jane sat in the back of the room waiting for the election results. In the weeks that had passed since Lisbeth had agreed to run, things had been contentious in the sorority house. Lisbeth hadn't needed to engage in the arguments, and if she tried to stop them, it only seemed to get worse. Instead, she acted as disinterested as she always had. Her speech had been simple: let's not go backwards. Congratulations, Lisbeth. Amidst the cheers and boos, someone called for a recount. It wasn't even close. In the end, Lisbeth won by a landslide. Mandy said and shut down any further discussion. Lisbeth, do you have something you want to say? Lisbeth got to her feet and looked at Lydia, making sure to put on her best fake smile. Thank you, everyone. I want next year to be one where we continue to rebuild our position as the university's oldest and most respected sorority. I hope you all are ready to do what you can to help. Thank you, Lisbeth, Mandy said. Let's move into programming vice president elections. Are there any nominations? Lisbeth's hand shot up in the air. Lots of hands went up for this one, and it was probably because Lydia had told her friends to nominate her for this position when she lost president. This is what Lydia really wanted after all. Okay, Mandy said. Lisbeth was first. I'd like to nominate Lydia. I can't think of a better person to head up our programming for the year. Lisbeth knew the younger woman's win was guaranteed already but relished the look of annoyance on Lydia's face. Lydia might have thought she was going to subvert Lisbeth's plans, but this made it clear that Lisbeth was ready for anything Lydia threw at her. Now that's how you act like an alpha, Jane whispered into Lisbeth's ear. Do you want to read more? This book is in A Little More Phi Alpha Pi, a short story companion book. Also read Pride, Prejudice, and Pledging to Learn How Lisbeth Survives the Year as Sorority President. Like or subscribe to this YouTube channel for more audiobooks and more.
Sriracha. Dude, what are you doing? Will looked up from the bright red t-shirt he was holding. His best friend Charlie stood next to him with a bright pink frozen drink in his hand. What do you think of his shirt? Will asked. He held up the shirt to show to Charlie. It was the infamous Sriracha shirt he had seen on his peers for many years. He had always ignored it, but there was one thing on the shirt that drew his attention for the first time. Is this about Lisbeth? Is this because she kissed you? It was on the cheek, Charlie. It was not a real kiss. Her lips willingly touched your skin. It's a real kiss. Will rolled his eyes and folded the t-shirt up again. Her thesis defense is tomorrow, Will said. I know, I'm going. Jane thinks she'll appreciate the support. Will looked over at his friend who was the happiest he had been since Halloween. Will was frustrated, but not because Charlie was happy, but because he, Will, had ruined everything with the one woman he wanted. He wasn't accustomed to being jealous of anyone, let alone his best friend. Over the past 9 months, he had been envious of everyone. He had been correctly mistrustful of Jorge, who had all the charm and ease with women that Will lacked. He had been resentful of Jeff, who made Lisbeth smile and didn't care about their aunt's opinion. He had even been bitter to Colin, who had never realized that Lisbeth was out of his league. He just wanted to be as happy as Charlie was, and when he was with Lisbeth he could almost touch it. It was his fault it hadn't happened. He had misunderstood her feeling about him once, and now he questioned every smile, gesture, touch, and look. Even when she seemed to be enjoying his company, he was all too aware of the reasons she had rejected him in November. But she had kissed him. This was the first time he had ever felt like this about anyone. His dating history was littered with bad decisions. He dated the right girls in high school and while he was at Tulane, but they always ended poorly. These women weren't bad people, but they weren't right for him. Caroline would have been just another misguided choice. She could play the proper role, she would run his life perfectly, give him perfect children, and build her life around her social life and image. She treated him like he was part of her brand and approached dating like negotiating a business deal. They had almost reached a mutually beneficial arrangement until he met Lisbeth. Now he questioned every assumption he had about his place in the world. She had changed him, even if she hadn't asked him to change. She had made him want to change. Does she like roosters? Is that her thing, like some girls love princesses or mermaids? Charlie asked. Will sat there thinking about the afternoon in the museum, and she made cock jokes to get him to laugh. He loved that she could say it all with a straight face, not even cracking a smile until the end. That had been body language even he couldn't deny. He thought about her jokes about her childhood career goals and her princess-based income. She is allowed to love all three. Charlie made a face that Will could not place. It was either a disinterested resigned shrug or a thoughtful realization that Will was correct. He should have kissed Lisbeth again, that day they went to the museum. There had been many missed opportunities. He still fantasized about what could have happened if he had taken the chance. There were countless fantasies of waking up with her in his bed and arms. He had planned, the day it all blew up with Lydia, to tell her that nothing had changed. He had prepared to take the most significant risk of his life. Then he saw the scowl again. He had ignored it the first time, but now he knew what it meant. It meant that she wanted to solve this problem on her own and not have a man do it for her. It meant he was infringing on a situation he did not understand. It meant she was annoyed. It meant she would always struggle to ask for help. It meant, if he genuinely wanted to help, he had to work on his own, so he did. No, but I believe she will understand the shirt's meaning. Then buy it and come to the defense in it. If she hates it, then she'll make that frowny face, you'll know it was a loss, and I'll take the shirt. Will could not argue with that logic. It was an inexpensive way to see if her feelings had changed. It was a safe way to learn if that kiss had meant something. He folded the shirt and followed Charlie as he meandered his way through the rest of the store. I mean, dude, let's be honest, Lisbeth is perfect for you, Charlie said as he traveled up and down the toy aisle on his way to the candy section. I admit, Will said, I have the same opinion. Nobody gets a rise out of you. No matter how hard my sister tries, and damn does she try, but she knows she doesn't have your attention. Why does she continue to try? That is what I fail to understand. Charlie shrugged. Is it that she has something to prove to Lisbeth? Will asked. Probably. I mean, man, Caroline now lives to piss her off. She seriously overestimates how many fucks Lisbeth has to give. Actually, I think Lisbeth gives a few fucks, as you say, about Caroline. At that dinner in January, when Caroline made comments about Jorge, Lisbeth seemed very irritated. She wanted to punch Caroline, Charlie said laughing. Will knew Charlie enjoyed when his younger sister was put in her place. Charlie loved Caroline, but he had allowed her to transfer with them because she would take care of his life. She kept everything in order, hiring a cleaning service, arranging food deliveries, paying the bills, and making sure Charlie didn't do something stupid. Clearly, Caroline had her own idea of what stupid was, and Will had already made the mistake of only seeing from her point of view. Had that been his first mistake in Lisbeth's eyes? Had she already heard Jorge's lies? Had it been something he had done before that? Okay, here's your plan, 'cause you suck at this. You wear that shirt to her thesis thing, and then you go away, Charlie said. Will put aside his own circling thoughts about Lisbeth and focused on Charlie's plan. This is why he needed this man as a friend. Should I speak to her to wish her good luck or congratulate her? Nope, not at all. You come in, stay in the back, and leave early. Why would I leave early? I wanted to hear her defense. I am quite interested in what she has to share. Her presentation last semester was very informative. Charlie stopped short in the middle of the game aisle and turned to his friend. She can repeat it for you another time. You're not there for the show, you're there to entice her and see her reaction to the shirt. I'll tell her you have a class to get to or some shit like that. Will did not care for the idea of lying to Lisbeth, but Charlie did understand the difference between flirting and annoyance, a skill Will did not seem to have learned. Then what? Will asked. You go see her that night and take her out for dinner. How will I know where to make a reservation if I don't talk to her? Fuck, you really suck at this. How have you ever gotten laid? Will did not have a response to that. Listen, Charlie continued, this is super casual. You're swinging by and thought she could use dinner. I'm sure they have dinner at the house. This is why you're not making reservations. Take her out for wings and beers. If she already had dinner, take her out for beer. The point is to get her alone, so you can actually talk. What do I say? I never know what to say to her. Then ask her questions. You've barely seen her since January. Ask her about the thesis if you're so fucking curious about how it ended. Tell her what you've been doing. I mean, she'll probably ask you anyway, but stop overthinking it, dude. That is what I do, Charlie. That's why you aren't syncing with her. Stop trying so hard. She's not that difficult. Jeff told me the same thing. Your cousin knows what he's talking about. You should be lucky he loves you because, from what you've said, she might have been with him instead. That would be very unfortunate. Fuck Will, it would suck ass. Stop trying to impress her with how smart and rich you are. She doesn't give a fuck about that. You don't have to use profanity, Charles. No, but it seems to have your attention. Charlie started walking again and Will fell in step behind him. They got to the junk food section, and Charlie began tossing his favorite candy into the cart. How do I know I can kiss her? Will asked. Charlie stopped, a bag of peanut M&Ms in his hands. For fuck's sake, Will. You're still overthinking it. She already kissed you. You'll just know. She slapped me the first time. I would rather not repeat that moment. And she's kissed you since. Do you want me to? Who's that guy with the nose? Cyrano de Bergerac? Yes. Do you want me to do that for you? I'll, tell you when you can kiss her. Will didn't react. You're right, I can do this myself. Good boy. I knew you'd see how stupid you're being.
Everyone wants a cookbook. Emma said to just take some simple pictures, Josh. They should still look good. You don't need to have a DSLR camera and all the high-tech stuff, Jack said to his son. We just need to give her a few ideas of what the food looks like when done. I stand by what I said. Becca was watching her father and brother create a cookbook proposal for Emma. Josh had finally convinced their father to write a cookbook. Their mother's publisher, Emma Shaw, had agreed to publish it if they could send her the proposal. Becca had heard her parents discussing the strengths and weaknesses of Emma's new publishing company and their lack of experience with cookbooks. Jack was willing to take a chance to do something different than his father. Becca wasn't sure what, precisely, was different about Jack's proposal, but she was happy to eat all the samples. If only Josh would finish up with his pictures before things got cold. Could I start a blog or YouTube channel with you? Becca asked as her brother fussed over the angle of his camera. No, you aren't going to start either, Jack said as he walked back into the kitchen to start the second dish for their proposal. What you can do is type up the recipes so Josh can format them when he finally takes a fucking picture. Josh looked up at Becca and rolled his eyes. Jack might be dismissive of the photos, but father and son did their own things to the same degree of intensity. The difference was that Jack wanted to only deal with the food and Josh wanted to build a social media empire around food. Considering their grandfather Abe was also an empire builder, Becca always thought Josh was an amusing blend of both men. Becca, meanwhile, fully supported her grandfather's plan for world domination through food. She was often inspired by him but had her own plans. Well, she would have her own plans someday. Now she was just learning. Lisbeth had no world domination plans, but she had a talent for seeing through bullshit. Becca respected that skill and was careful not to get on her big sister's bad side. Once there, it was usually impossible to change her mind. Only one person had seemed to have accomplished this, but Becca was unclear how he had achieved that. She was working hard to figure it out. Come fall, when she and Ginny Darcy would be roommates at New York University, she hoped to gather more data. Is a print cookbook really worth your time? Becca called back to Jack, just trying to poke at her father. It would be an ebook too, Josh said. But videos are really where it's growing. Daddy would be on the cutting edge. Most chefs aren't doing videos, it's just YouTube personalities, home chefs, and brands. And Gordon Ramsay, Jack said as he moved around the kitchen. Everyone wants a cookbook. They look good on the shelf, and if Emma wants something like videos, then we'll discuss it with the contract. Becca pulled out her keyboard and tablet so she could type up the recipe from her father's notes. She heard the clicks of the camera as Josh finally took his pictures and put the crock of French onion soup next to her. Jack, already cooking again in the kitchen, was making something with plenty of garlic. The smell made Becca's mouth water. She finished typing the recipe before picking up her spoon. Her father's soup was something he only made for the family because he used champagne with the stock. While they waited for their father to finish dish 2, something he was calling bagel and lox quiche, Josh and Becca demolished the soup, even picking off the hard bits of cheese on the side. Gruyere? Becca asked her brother. He's never used anything else. Swiss cheese is an abomination and cheddar is only really good when you use beer in the base. Is this really how you want to spend your time? Taking pictures of food and creating cookbooks. Josh looked down into the crock, pretending to look for last bits to eat. He had spent years training to be a chef. I love the food, but I'm good at the promotion and management. I don't want to be in the kitchen. You spend all your time there, cooking, and not talking to customers. Plus, it takes forever to get anywhere. Please, Papa would let you take over now. Yeah, but I'm really good at the other stuff and I love it. Papa said I can take over the promotional stuff for his restaurants. Becca was a little surprised, but she knew he was right. Josh was great in the kitchen. He had learned about food from 2 men who had spent their entire lives there. Josh wasn't Abe or Jack, and always seemed miserable when stuck in the kitchen. He was really good at keeping everything running smoothly and dealing with people. As irritated as Jack was with the fussing, Becca could tell he was enjoying working with his son in a way that didn't mess up his kitchen. The quiche will be ready in a few minutes, Jack said as he came out of the kitchen and taking away the crock and spoons. Does this mean all 3 of us are going to be in New York City? Becca asked her brother when Jack was back in the kitchen. Now the cookbook made sense. Layla couldn't seem to get the kids out of the house fast enough, but it was Jack who was dealing with the empty nest anxiety. Becca decided to make a point of coming home just to see Jack. She looked down at the tablet and cleaned up the formatting of the recipe. Now she wanted to make sure it looked so good that Emma and her partner couldn't say no. Marie and Kitty's plan to take over the world. Do you think we'll fall in love this year? You know, like Jane and Lisbeth did last year. Kitty said to Marie. The new Phi Alpha Pi president and membership vice president were laying in their beds, in the room they shared. Marie was trying to finish her last pleasure read before she had to get started with her books for classes. Kitty was playing Pokemon Go. Somehow the sorority house had been identified as a gym over the summer, and now half the sisters were playing. Marie had initially been irritated with the people coming to the house just to get to the gym, but that changed when their first rush event, earlier that evening, had brought in more potential pledges than ever before. Not only were there more people, but the women there were far more diverse than past years. Marie was acutely aware of this sorority's lack of any diversity. "I don't think it works like that," Marie said into the dark of the room. "I want to fall in love. Maybe a cute freshman will join this year." Have sisters dated each other? Marie had to think about it. "Kitty, you might be our first lesbian, so no." Marie heard Kitty sigh in the dark. "Everyone here is so white and straight," she eventually said. "You know," Marie said, "I joined because of Charlotte and Lisbeth. Charlotte wasn't like anyone else." "Well, she's African American, Marie. It's hard to be like everyone else." That wasn't it. It was that neither of them was perfectly presentable. They weren't performing some type of sorority version of themselves. Charlotte always had paint under her fingernails, and Lisbeth openly rolled her eyes at everyone. "Why did you pick Lisbeth as your big sister?" Kitty asked. "Because Charlotte didn't want one. Lisbeth was my second pick." "Why did you pick Lydia?" "She didn't care how I was different. She liked that I wanted to have fun." "Well, you do, but you're much more responsible about it than she was." The two were silent for a moment, both thinking about how frivolity had almost destroyed Lydia. "I miss her," Kitty eventually said. "I miss all three of them. I'm worried that I'm going to ruin everything." Marie heard Kitty giggling quietly. "What? It's not funny." "No, it's just that I was worried about that too. I thought I would disappoint you on top of it." Marie started laughing, and they kept getting louder until someone banged on a wall to shut them up. It made Marie feel better to have Kitty just as afraid about this year. "Marie," Kitty said about a minute later. "What? What if we only accepted the anti-sorority members?" Marie was initially shocked by the idea, but it took her 10 seconds to change her mind. "What do you mean?" "Like, if our reputation is for husband crazy, party girl bitches, then let's take the exact opposite." "But will they want to join us?" "Pokemon, Marie. They came tonight because we have something stupid that no other sorority or fraternity house has. This house is like a historical landmark. I know you noticed how different they were too. Let's use it to our advantage. Let's take the girls who won't typically get in a sorority." "The normal girls?" Marie asked. "The normal girls, the lesbians, the artsy ones, the geeks, the nerds, the smart ones, the ones who want to belong somewhere, the ones who want to feel special, the ones like us. Lisbeth and Charlotte started it, so let's continue it. Do you think the other sisters will allow it? The ones like Caroline and Lydia?" "Maybe, but my pledge class came to this sorority with Lisbeth's leadership and saw what happened to Lydia. We're not the majority, but I think we can tip the scales in favor of this." Marie had given up reading her book and had been imagining the sorority Kitty was building with her words. It was an overwhelming feeling for Marie, the idea that she wouldn't be the only of something among her sisters. "It will push some away," Marie said, wiping the tears from her eyes. "Good, out with the old. The sisters like Caroline are entitled snobs." The two roommates started giggling again. "You know, Kitty, it's a good thing you're using your powers for good. Nobody would guess you're this cunning." "I'm willing to do a lot to get a girlfriend, Marie. Just imagine what I would do if I had real power." Marie made a mental note before turning off her tablet and going to bed. Je t'aime, Monsieur Darcy. The last time you were here, it was that spring break, correct? Will asked me with a sly smile. We had been in Paris for less than a day. In fact, we had just woken up from a much-needed nap after a long, red-eye flight from New York. I had dozed on the plane but had been too excited to sleep. We had been to France a couple of times since graduating from college 5 years ago, but we never come to Paris. We had visited Toulouse, where my grandfather's family had lived before the Nazis, and my grandmother's family who still lived in Lyon, a region I had often visited during my life. We had driven along the northern coast seeing Calais, Dunkirk, and all through Normandy visiting World War II battlegrounds, Will's vacation pics. When he promised me Paris as a holiday gift, I immediately found myself remembering the last time I had been there and how much I had wanted him there with me. He had refused to let me plan anything, and I realized this was not going to be a typical vacation. My suspicions were confirmed when he bought tickets for a February trip. From there I just had to bully Jane into admitting that, yes, Will was planning a proposal. A tiny of me was worried that Will would do something cliched at the Eiffel Tower and it wouldn't be us. The last time I was in this spot, Caroline confronted me and demanded I swear to her I wouldn't date you, ever. We were outside St. Sulpice, at the fountain in the square, indulging in much-needed coffee and macarons. Not only did we need the caffeine, but also the warmth since it was February. We were bundled up in our coats and gloves, with hats and scarves I had knit just for the trip. Will wrapped his arm around me and scooted closer, probably pretending he was keeping us warmer. In reality, I knew he just wanted me to rest against him, which I was happy to do, for the warmth. Well, your wish has been granted. Now what? I hadn't expected that question since Will had taken charge of planning the trip. He had consulted with Jane, who had, she swore to me, told him everything we had done that March when we came with the French majors. I knew this wasn't a recreation of that same trip. We were staying for 10 days, and I wanted to go to the Northanger Europe amusement park, Versailles, and spend an entire day in the Louvre. He knew all of this because I had made Jane suggest these things to him and coerced Charlie to reiterate it. I think even Caroline, who had finally let go of her fantasy of stealing Will away from me, had given a few nudges about things to do here. I hadn't realized how much she had paid attention when we designed our tour of Marais years ago. I'm following you. You tell me where to go next. It was completely dark by the time we got up to the top of the Eiffel Tower. As we stood together, looking over the city, I could feel the tears filling my eyes. I was in the city I loved with the only man I had ever loved, and almost not had the chance to enjoy, after years of dreaming about this. I don't think I could have stopped the tears if I tried. Instead, I just kept wiping my eyes with a tissue. Will stood behind me, his arms around my waist, and his chin resting on my shoulder. You are right, this is the one place we should only do together. I turned around, into his arms, and let him hold me close. Eventually, and without a word, we went back inside and into the warm champagne bar for a drink. I was surprised at how anxious I was. As much as I wanted to be here with only Will, this was where marriage proposals happened, and I didn't want this man to think about cliched proposals. I tried to relax and enjoy Will's company, but it took so much energy. It dawned on me, once I had finished my glass of champagne, that this is what he often felt when he had to socialize and, 5 years ago, how he felt when around me. Why are you so anxious? Will asked. I could only imagine the panic on my face, but I didn't know what to say. I had no experience being the anxious one in our relationship. Want to get dinner? He asked. Yes. It was all I could say, and I didn't even wait for a response before turning away. "Wait a moment, Lisbeth," Will said. I turned around to see my boyfriend on his knee, and he was tying his sneaker. He looked up at me with a huge grin on his face and laughing. "You should see the look on your face. What did you think I was doing?" he asked as he stood up. I was still lost for words. "Were you under the impression that I was about to propose to you?" I slowly nodded. Will put his hand in mine and led me back to the elevator to go back to the streets of Paris. "This is, quite possibly, going to be the most enjoyable vacation I have ever been on," Will told me as we started walking away from the tower. "Jane told me you're going to propose," I finally said. "You are aware that I do not succumb to clichés, are you not?" "Yes, of course, but you brought me to Paris for Valentine's Day." I made the assumption that this was ironic. Will started laughing almost maniacally. It was rare to see him enjoy something so publicly. "You set me up, didn't you?" I asked. "I know you perfectly, Lisbeth Dreyfus. I knew you would immediately ask Jane and Charlie." It was all confirmed when even Caroline found it necessary to weigh in on this trip. "So, you're not proposing?" "Did I suggest that?" "William." I refused to confirm or deny. "You will just have to wait and see." The entire trip continued the same way. We walked the Pont des Arts bridge, looking at what remained of the lovelocks that once crowded the chain-link fencing. Even though they had banned the locks, people still put them up. It was well known that they would eventually be removed by someone. There were a few scattered on both sides of the bridge, and there was a couple of carts selling locks. Will pulled something out of his pocket and got down on a knee. It turned out he was putting a tiny lock on the bottom. When he pulled me down, I read what he had written on it, "L&W, not yet." He made sure to take a picture before pulling it off the fence and handing it to me. I slipped it into my pocket without a word, and he laughed all the way to the Louvre. He did it again in front of a bronze Coke statue in the Louvre, picking up a piece of paper he purposefully dropped. I wasn't worried about it being a cliché. After all, it was a rooster, and that was our thing. His game through the entire city, out on our trip to Versailles, and even in the Northanger Europe Park as we waited in line for rides. "I don't think I even know who you are anymore," I said, half joking, half pouting, as we waited in line for a roller coaster. "The tables have turned, and I have the upper hand for the first time in our entire relationship. I am going to relish my power as long as I can." "Just to torture me?" "For all you know, we will get off this ride, and I will follow it with a proposal. You should not simply assume this is merely amusement for me, but admittedly, it is." By the end of the trip, I was exhausted from trying to guess if each gesture or small present was the beginning of an orchestrated proposal. When we got comfortable on the plane to go home, I lifted the armrest between us and nestled into Will's body. "Tired?" Will asked after he kissed the top of my head. "Very," I said as I closed my eyes, not opening them again until we touched down in New York. It was late at night when we got home and I was still groggy. I knew I would crash again once we were back in our bed, and I was looking forward to my spot and my pillow again. I felt a bit of disappointment that Will hadn't, in the end, proposed in Paris. As much as I had dreaded the way he might do it, I wanted him to finally propose. It had been emotionally exhausting trying to anticipate something that hadn't happened, and it was the cruelest thing he had ever done. It wasn't that I thought I was entitled to a proposal in Paris, it just was something he let continue the entire trip without a resolution. I went through my night routine in the bathroom in our apartment, the one Will had lived in for most of his life. When I emerged into our bedroom, once a library that had been converted into Will's bedroom and upgraded to a master suite a few years ago, I found Will setting up all the knickknacks I had purchased on the shelves that held my books. Will had refused to let me buy cheap souvenirs. As I watched him from our bed, I realized he had more than our souvenirs out. He was also putting up an extensive collection of Eiffel Tower statues of all shapes and designs. He said nothing as he put them all over our room, blocking pictures, books, and other knickknacks I had there. When he was done, he quietly opened the curtains to reveal our view of New York City. Years before, when I had unexpectedly walked into this bedroom, I had been so entranced with the vast collection of books that I had failed to appreciate the fantastic view of New York City. The windows in the room were floor to ceiling. Both of us seemed to sleep better with the city lights coming into our room. Will got into bed next to me and kissed my lips. "Was the trip everything you thought it would be?" he asked. "You know it wasn't. Life never is." "That's certainly true. Where did all those statues come from?" "I had them shipped here, and Jane brought them in." "Why? Do you think I would ask you to marry me in a city that means something to you only?" Will leaned back and took something off his bedside table. When he turned back, I saw it was a small, handmade box that looked like a book. Someone had painted a miniature Eiffel Tower on the cover. Will. I wanted to do it in both cities at the same time, but obviously that defines the laws of physics as we know them. This was my alternative, the city you love and the city where you decided you might love me. I opened the box to see a platinum ring with a princess-cut sapphire ring which was surrounded by small diamonds. I had my mother's ring reset. Much like the entire week before this, I was speechless. I let Will put the ring on my finger, which fit perfectly. I never intended to propose in Paris. I have planned this proposal from the very moment I decided I was going to marry you. It was always going to happen right here, like this. Please, say yes. Yes. Je t'aime, Monsieur Darcy, I said as I leaned in to kiss him. The Year of the Rooster. Why is this room filled with roosters? Ginny asked. She had just arrived at the apartment to find Lisbeth on the floor, setting up the baby's room. She was surrounded by bags and boxes, sheets and clothes in a laundry basket, and stuffed toys scattered everywhere. At least Will had set up the furniture already. "Because she's going to be born in the year of the rooster," Lisbeth said. "Yeah, I know, but roosters aren't typical baby decor for either boys or girls." "I know. You can't imagine how difficult it's been to find rooster sheets and blankets. It's all stuff for kitchens, but that's the joy of the internet. Did you know you can print your own fabric? You bought all this online?" Lisbeth's look suggested this was obvious. "A couple of these are Northanger Studios movie characters. They apparently have a thing for roosters. I got them at the mall." Ginny watched as Lisbeth pulled out a plush version of a character that Ginny remembered from her childhood. She couldn't remember that character's name, but the movie was older than her. She remembered its colorful details from a toy that Will had loved when they were little. There were some plastic storage bins in the building's basement that were full of Will's childhood toys. "Does Will know you're doing this decor?" Ginny asked. "Not yet, but he will when he gets home." Ginny tried to figure out how her brother would react. Lisbeth and Will had been together for 12 years. They had their fair share of inside jokes, but this was their first child. Will had already been showing signs of increasing anxiety. She wasn't sure her brother would be in the mood for his firstborn child to experience the first few years of her life surrounded by roosters. What if he isn't okay with it? Trust me, Lisbeth said as she unpacked another box of sheets, probably custom made for this child. Ginny decided to trust her sister-in-law. This was the woman who got Will to smile and laugh again. Those inside jokes had to be part of it. I have to go get something that will help, Ginny said and left the penthouse apartment. Even though Ginny had grown up in the apartment, she hadn't moved back in after graduating from New York University 8 years ago. First, she shared an apartment with her cousin and Lisbeth's sister Becca for years until all three of them moved on to their own lives. Lisbeth and Will had moved in after they each finished graduate school. Lisbeth had gotten a job in academia while Will had started managing the family's real estate. He had primarily been working out of the apartment and was going to be a stay-at-home dad with baby Olivia, who was just 2 months away from coming into the world. Ginny took the elevator down to the basement, grabbing the keys to the storage area before leaving. She hoped the bins of Will's toys were still there. Roosters had been a part of the Lisbeth/Will relationship since before it was a relationship and had been around their various homes over the past 12 years. It wasn't the Americana style of roosters but modern art and pop culture references. She realized that they had tons of sriracha-related things, shirts, posters, coasters, kitchen items, but she never saw them eat it. She had only slightly registered that they changed a lot of Valentine's Day symbols to roosters. Had they planned this pregnancy to specifically happen in the year of the rooster? If this was their biggest inside joke, then she wanted to make sure Lisbeth knew the depth of Will's love for roosters. The elevator doors opened to the silent, cold, and dark basement. She quickly found the light switch and turned on the flickering ancient fluorescent lights. Making a mental note to remind Will to change the bulbs, she made her way back to the family's storage area. She unlocked the gate and quickly found the clear plastic bins full of old toys. Her brother had loved that Northanger studio movie all of Ginny's life, she just couldn't remember the name. It had been one of those folk story animated films, but the people had been changed to animals that suited their personalities. She felt like it had something to do with King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. That was also one of Will's favorite stories. His favorite toy, the stuffed animal that slept on his bed with him through most of his childhood, had been the rooster that had been a prominent part of the story. Maybe he had represented Merlin or something. There were tons of amazing things to discover in each of the crates. Toys Ginny remembered fondly and made her tear up thinking of the life they had before their mother died. She remembered Will becoming quieter, more anxious, and sterner after that happened. It had been Lisbeth's influence that softened him. It had taken them a while to decide to get married and have kids. Ginny always assumed that her brother's anxiety and Lisbeth's minimal interest in kids were two of the reasons. This little girl was going to change everything, and even Will couldn't avoid it. His decision to be the stay-at-home parent had surprised everyone, even Lisbeth. Ginny decided to just bring up all the crates. It would be easier to let Will and Lisbeth go through them together. It would also allow Will the chance to connect his new life to his childhood. She found a dolly and stacked the crates to take upstairs. Lisbeth. I found something for you, Ginny called out as she got back into the apartment. Lisbeth came out of the bedroom, her eyes getting wider as she realized what was in the crates. Where was all of this? Is this your stuff and Will's? Fuck yeah, this is perfect, Lisbeth said without giving Ginny a chance to respond. Hold on, I need to find something specific. Ginny started opening the crates again, pulling out the toys and just putting them on the floor. Lisbeth managed to get down on the ground, looked at each of the items, and periodically identified which of the siblings she thought it had belonged to. Ginny noticed she was making 3 piles as she touched each toy. Which is the discard pile? Ginny asked. Discard? Lisbeth said with a laugh. No, this is the keep pile, the maybe pile, and the clearly I need to make fun of Will for having played with pile. That last pile was full of toys that clearly belonged to her brother, dried up Gak, something called Mr. Bucket, bizarre Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, a Bop It, too many Kush balls, and POGs. These were probably things that had been handed down from older cousins and should be thrown away. Found it, Ginny said when she was in the second of the 3 bins. She pulled out a fluffy, colorful rooster stuffed doll. Lisbeth's eyes got big, and she stretched out her arm, making the gimme gesture. Holy shit, Lisbeth said as she looked at the doll. This is Taliesin from that Northanger Arthurian movie from the 1960s, Lisbeth said. That's his name. I couldn't remember his name. My mother loves this movie. I forgot there was a rooster in it. Was this Will's doll? Yep, and I don't know if he remembers it. Lisbeth slowly got to her feet, ignoring all the other toys that had been discovered, and waddled back into the baby's room. This is going to be so much fun to show your brother. Ginny watched the doll get placed on the wooden rocking chair that had been a gift from Lisbeth's grandparents in Massachusetts. The 2 went back to the crates and moved them into the bedroom. Over the next few hours, the 2 women went through the containers and decided which toys would be saved for when the baby was older, which would go into the room now, and which needed to be trashed after showing them to Will. A few things, like the dried-up Gak, were thrown away immediately. They were having so much fun with the toys that they didn't hear Will come back from his meeting and walk to the baby's room. What? Ginny and Lisbeth both looked up to see Will standing in the door to the bedroom, looking around at all the roosters decorating his unborn daughter's future living space. Ginny reached over and grabbed the rooster off the rocking chair. She wanted to make sure her brother saw this specific toy. I felt Sriracha wasn't appropriate and she's not going to be old enough to appreciate modern art, Lisbeth said to her husband. I love it, Will said quietly, eyes still wide and taking in all the decorations. Ginny watched as a smile spread over Lisbeth's face. I found something that you might have forgotten about, Ginny said. Once Will was looking at his younger sister, she tossed the rooster. Will looked confused but caught the toy. Taliesin? Where did you find him? Will asked. In the basement with all our toys, Ginny said. I didn't realize your love of roosters was lifelong, Lisbeth said. I forgot about Taliesin. He was my favorite character from that movie. Why did you even like a movie from the 1960s? Ginny asked. Mom loved it and bought the VHS when they remastered it. We had a bunch of Northanger movies. They are probably in the basement, too. Ginny watched as tears filled Will's eyes. I'm going to see if I can find those, she said. As she left the room, Ginny glanced back to see her brother sit down with his wife. She watched as Lisbeth put her hand on his cheek and wiped the tears off with her thumb. Ginny knew at that moment that little Olivia would never lack love. I just want to help. Welcome to the new Woodhouse Hall. That's what the banner said at the entrance to the dorm. I had spent days making the sign, allowed to move in early so I could spread out and make the sign. I was more than happy to do it since not only do I love this stuff, but loving my mother sometimes meant not being around her. After I painted the sign, I got my floor ready for the residents. I did the things I remember Adam struggling to do, the doors, the bulletin board, and the rules. I thought back to my freshman year when he had come into the room I was sharing with Amelia, hours after I had moved in, completely panicked. I remember him looking at her like she was the only one who could solve his problems. I quickly learned that she was. Amelia is a problem solver and a problem maker. I would later learn about the problem maker bit. I had scoured Pinterest for ideas on what to do for decorations. Nothing was up to my standards, and I found myself looking back on the decorations I had done during my freshman year. I didn't want to repeat too many. I used our school mascot, the gamecock, as the theme for all the floor decorations. I found my way to the education department, where they had a die-cut machine for teachers who needed to make their own classroom tools. I was in heaven and considered changing my major again. When I sent Amelia a text about it, she reminded me that it was my senior year. If I still wanted to do this at the end of the year, I could get a master's degree. I did a walk-through of the floor. I had 10 minutes before the first freshman would arrive. They would take all day, have orientation tomorrow, and any returning students would come over the weekend. Woodhouse Hall was brand new, but the family had negotiated to make sure there was one floor dedicated to the freshmen who needed affordable housing. I was picked to be the resident assistant for the floor. I knew why, and I was fine with it. Not only had I been a freshman in the old Woodhouse Hall, but I had been a vital member of the team that had fought to maintain affordable housing for the campus. Also, Amelia worked for the Woodhouse family, and Adam still knew people in the housing office. I had been an RA for a freshman floor of 2 other dorms in the past. I was good with freshmen. I remember what that year had been like, and I had one of the best RAs to help me get through it. I went back to my room when I heard the elevator start to move down to the first floor. I kept my door open, but we had been asked to give the families some time to move in before we introduced ourselves. I sat in my room, my desk facing the door so people could see me while I did any work, and went over the list of residents. I had access to their personal profiles, full of the details they had felt were essential for their roommate and me to know. I had skimmed, but now I looked closer, and one person caught my eye. Her name was Lydia, and the picture showed a redhead with a big smile spread across her face. This was the photo for her ID card. She looked older than the average freshman, and when I looked at her details, I realized she wasn't average or a freshman. She had been kicked out of a school in Georgia a few years ago, been through trauma, she put it in quotes on her profile. She had taken time off and then gotten her AA degree before transferring up here. She had supportive friends in the region and wanted a small college to finish her degree. She even mentioned she was a member of the Phi Alpha Pi sorority. I sent Kaylee a quick text to see if she knew anything about Lydia. I didn't expect a quick reply. She was moving into an apartment today with her sorority sisters. The day passed quickly, a few tears were shed, and a few fights came to a head for the freshmen and their families. I reassured parents that their children would be fine without them. I reassured children that they would survive without their parents. I was given EpiPens to keep in our first aid kit for allergy emergencies. I was asked for and said no to personal text updates. One father asked me to take pictures of his son every day and post them to a Facebook group. I politely said I wasn't allowed to do that, but in my head, I wondered what kind of preschool they thought this was. By the time I fell asleep, I was feeling confident that these freshmen would survive the year. I brought the pizza up to the floor's common room as soon as it was delivered. The freshmen were already trickling in, exhausted from the last day of orientation and the emotions of their parents' departures. Tomorrow other people would move into the dorm, but not on our floor. My job now was to help them feel relaxed and at home before their classes began. Pizza was something that always seemed to work. I had a secret motive. I wanted to see the dynamic between people. If past years had been any indication, floor events were an excellent chance to see how people interacted. You could see which roommates were getting along, which were already at war, who was struggling with homesickness, who was making friends quickly, who preferred introversion, they might not even show up, and anything else that would help me support them. The elevator door opened, and I heard a loud, feminine laugh coming from the common room. I came in to find one redhead surrounded by freshman boys, the other girls sitting on their own, glaring at her. I hadn't met Lydia yet. Her roommate, Patty, had been alone when I came by to meet them. I looked over at Patty. She was sitting alone, looking torn as she glanced over at Lydia and the group of glaring girls. "Pizza's here," I said and laid out the boxes for food preferences. They all rushed up to the table full of pizza boxes and grabbed what they could. More people started coming in. Clearly, the smell of pizza had served as the lure I had hoped for. I gave everyone time to eat, watching Lydia continue to sit among the boys and the other girls staying away from them. As others came in, the dynamic continued to grow. I went over to Patty, who was one of the few people sitting alone. "How was orientation?" I asked her when I sat down. She let out a deep, exhausted sigh. "Confusing. I can answer, like, any questions. I know how overwhelming orientation can be, you know?" I said and gave her a big smile. "I asked Lydia some questions," she said, her eyes darting back over to her giggling roommate. "She said she's been a freshman before, and all I needed to do was focus on making tons of friends and maybe find a guy to treat me like a goddess." I quickly flashed back to my own first week on campus, and Amelia's initial plan to set me up with a boyfriend, like it was the answer to all my problems. Her intentions had been good, but her execution had turned into a disaster. I watched Lydia for a few moments and recognized that she was nothing like Amelia. Lydia was a classic extrovert who liked being the center of attention. She lacked Amelia's diplomacy and ability to draw everyone in, not just men. "Do you want a boyfriend?" I asked Patty, sensing she was holding something back. She turned to face me and gave me a lopsided smile. "Yes, I'm not interested in a boyfriend." I debated pushing her for more clarity. Did she want a girlfriend, boyfriend, or nobody? Did she simply not want a relationship now because she had other things to focus on? I let it sit there. She had chosen her words, and she would tell me more if she wanted. "You don't have to do what Lydia says," I reminded her, focusing on the more important issue. "This is your chance to find what's right for you both academically and socially. Guys are always coming by, and she keeps introducing them to me. She says she's sworn off guys for a while, but they're always there." "I think she's inviting them to meet me," Patty whispered, her eyes checking the spot where Lydia was still giggling. "Did you tell her that you're uncomfortable?" I asked, leaning in and lowering my voice so only she could hear me. "No, I don't know how." I nodded, remembering my own reluctance to tell Amelia the truth that year. I had met someone I wanted to be with, but Amelia was so sure that I followed her lead rather than listening to my instinct. "Can you talk to her?" Patty asked. I considered the request. It would give me the chance to finally speak to Lydia. "Just this once, but I want you to practice telling her what you want. Do it with little things." Patty sighed again and nodded. I gave her a smile and went to chat with another resident. Lydia was the one thing they all wanted to talk about. She had been giving them all advice about different things like dealing with their roommates and homesickness. The advice was often unwanted or unhelpful, leaving the girls feeling annoyed and angry. This, not that she was surrounded by the men, was the root of the tension in the room. I wondered if Lydia thought there was no RA to help people. I got back to my room that night and debated about what to do next. I needed advice and sent a message to both Adam and Amelia to meet for breakfast the next morning. They both made a point of being available to me during move-in week. I liked being able to work through the floor's issues with them together. Now I had a crucial reason to get Amelia's help. Amelia sighed as she put a piece of bacon in her mouth. She treated it like other people treated coffee first thing in the morning and couldn't function without it. Today she had gotten oatmeal with a side of bacon. I watched as she poured sugar and cinnamon into the bowl and then broke up nearly all the bacon to sprinkle on top. She saved one piece to eat first. I was often surprised at the ways she managed to make bacon work in any breakfast. Adam, who had probably been watching her do this for most of their lives, focused on his omelet, bacon-free. I had my favorite pancakes, chocolate chips and bananas, with the butter melting on top as I poured syrup over them. We had waited 30 minutes for a table at the most popular diner in town, but it was worth it. First week struggles? Adam asked when he swallowed his first bite of omelet. We talked briefly about it while we waited, but focused on the work Amelia was doing for the Woodhouse family and romantic drama that had happened a few months ago. Now I recapped the conversation I had with Patty and what I knew about Lydia. Is she in a place where she's talking about her traumatic event? Adam asked me. I haven't had a chance to talk to her yet, I said, shaking my head. I'm more concerned that she's, giving advice to the other residents. Amelia and I looked at each other, our eyes meeting. She knew I wasn't accusing her of anything. We had worked through that problem years ago and been able to become better friends because of it. Is the advice bad? Amelia asked as she mixed her oatmeal more. It appears so, but she doesn't need to give them advice. That's why I'm there, right? Adam smiled and quickly laughed to himself. Nothing feels more irritating than someone trying to help but stepping on your toes. That too probably referenced the way he saw Amelia's activities the year we all lived in Woodhouse Hall. What do I do? I asked them both. Simple, Adam said, direct her need to advise. Give her a task that utilized her strengths. If she likes the guys, have her support them for a short period of time, like for midterms. Amelia's mouth dropped open. If that doesn't work? I asked, ignoring Amelia's growing irritation. Try something else next time. You're going to be overwhelmed at some point, you know that, he said and put his hand on Amelia's clenching fist. What about, the boyfriend hunt? I asked, turning to Amelia, who I felt should be able to advise me better on this. Lydia might not hear you or Patty complain until it's smacking her in the face, Amelia said, turning away from Adam to meet my eyes. Let lead the conversation there. I think you encouraging Patty to speak to her directly is good advice. I might have seen things differently if we had more direct conversations about Eric. I took in their advice and let the conversation drift to other topics. Before we left, I sent Lydia a message asking if we could have a check-in chat that afternoon. Her response was so full of emojis, it took me a few rereads to realize she happily agreed to the request. I'm so excited to meet you finally, Lydia said, dropping into the empty armchair in my room. She was undoubtedly a direct person. She didn't knock or announce herself. I had been lying on my bed reading an article for my first class on Tuesday morning. She had an energy about her that made me feel like she never stopped to rest, almost like the Tasmanian devil in old cartoons. I'm sorry I didn't get to meet you when everyone was moving in. Oh, I'm going to be spending a lot of time at the Phi Alpha Pi offices. I was surprised there aren't any sorority houses. I almost missed the deadline for a room because I kept expecting them to invite me to live in the house. I sat up and turned to face her. There aren't any sorority houses in Massachusetts. They might still have the laws that prevent a certain number of women from living in the same house. Why? She asked, looking offended. I looked at her and said, without any emotion, prostitution. She threw her head back and laughed as if this was the funniest joke anyone had ever told her. That reaction made me feel more comfortable with her than I had anticipated. I can assure you, she said as she wiped away a tear, less sex happens in a sorority house than anyone realizes. I lived in one for a few months before I had to leave due to my traumatic experience. I knew to tread carefully here, to let her decide how much to share about whatever had happened. As much as the quotes on the page made me expect something ironic from her about it, her body language said something different. I saw your profile before you moved in, I said, hoping she would take the opportunity to open up more. She shrugged. I've gotten a lot of therapy for it, you don't have to worry. If you're not worried, then I'm not, I quickly said. She smiled and sighed. I'm focused on getting my degree, not partying, and not guys. I noticed they seem to flock to you. She nodded. I try to redirect their energy to other women. Sometimes it works. They like me because I'm friendly, and other women are defensive. I had to be careful here. I couldn't tell if her trauma was related to a man or not. She had so many mixed messages and wasn't being as direct as I had hoped she would be. I decided to focus on the two issues I wanted to address. She had opened up the conversation to one already. How are you redirecting their energy? I asked. Oh, easy, I'm going to help my roommate find a boyfriend. She needs to get laid. She's so uptight. I thought about my response and decided to open up to her the way I hoped she would open up to me. Can I tell you a story about what happened to me during my freshman year? I finally asked. Sure, she said with a shrug. I proceeded to tell her my side of the Eric story. I, too, had been through some therapy to process what had happened. It was why I didn't blame Amelia for being oblivious to both Eric and me during those few months. Did he rape her? Lydia asked with wide eyes when I got to the part about Eric's attack. No, he didn't get that far, but it was traumatic for both Amelia and me. Even though he had been caught attacking her, he wove a story that made him our victim, and the university believed him over us, especially some male professors. What happened to him? She asked, leaning closer to me and putting her elbows on her knees. The administrators who believed us weren't able to do much, and the cops didn't care, but the other students did, and he kept digging a deeper hole. You should ask the Phi Alpha Pi sisters about him. I think Kaylee knows some of the stories. You know Kaylee? I love her. Lydia said, straightening up with a bounce. Yep, she lived in the room next to us that year. Awesome, but, not awesome. I smiled. I told you this, so, you think twice about setting up someone you don't know yet. Maybe Patty isn't interested in a boyfriend. Maybe, like you, she's focused on her academics. Lydia leaned back and thought about something. I wanted to help her. I know, I said, and I really did believe her. I want to help everyone avoid the same mistakes I did, she said, leaning closer to me again. Helping people is difficult, but I know I'm going to need help throughout the semester. You've done this before, so what if I come to you when I need help? In what way? She asked, a bit confused. Well, I suspect people will need to be encouraged to come to floor events. Maybe you can, help get them there? Also, midterms will be stressful, and I could use help dealing with anxiety. Lydia nodded her head and looked over at my desk. I can be like the RA's intern. Sure. I'm going to add a spot for these things in my planner, so I remember when you'll need help. She said before jumping out of the chair and leaving the room. I sat there, stunned, for a minute before she rushed back in with a teal-colored journal. She sat back down and opened up her bullet journal. I couldn't stop myself from laughing. Maybe she was more like me than I realized. Dinner at Beacon and Charles. Have you ever done this before? Hannah asked as our ride drove us to meet our shuttle bus. I was sitting next to Hannah in the back of the car and shook my head. In the year since we had started working here in Tampa, I had heard rumors about this new, expensive, and exclusive dining experience they were developing in the Northanger Universe Park. Yesterday Diana Northanger had asked us to put together a party of 12 friends to do a test run of this unique dining experience. I said yes, and it took me 2 hours to find enough people. This week, they've invited executives to participate, but Diana can't attend, so we got lucky. I added. How much would this cost? Hannah asked Ethan, who was sitting in the front seat. Should we tell Dad about this? Ethan shook his head as the driver pulled up to the shuttle bus taking our group into the park. Not yet, he said. I spotted my brother Daniel and our friend Melissa as we walked to the shuttle. They were talking to a woman I didn't recognize. We had invited our closest friends and family first, but filled the other half of the group with some colleagues we liked. The project managers weren't invited to this new restaurant's free trial, so those I had included were ecstatic. I could see some of them standing outside laughing as they talked, and some were even bouncing in their excitement. You're the last to arrive, Melissa said. We need to get in our seats. I wasn't the last person on the shuttle. The only person behind me was the woman I didn't know. I picked up the black sequined kitty ears as I sat in the front seat next to Ethan. I looked around, and all the women were wearing the same pair. The men had been given ties with kitty heads printed on them. Ethan was busy replacing his tie with the new one. Are we all ready? A woman said as she stepped on the shuttle and nodded at the driver. While we drive to the special entrance to the park, I'm going to explain what to expect. We all started clapping as the shuttle doors closed and the driver pulled away. There was so much excited energy in the shuttle, and everyone was focused on this woman. I'm Denise, and I'll be one of your hosts this evening, she said when the applause died down. We'll be eating a menu designed by Chef Jack Dreyfus. His menu will be available all year, and then another celebrity chef will design a new menu each year. I could hear mutterings of the other people on the shuttle. He's from Boston, right? Ethan asked me. I nodded and recalled my parents taking us to his restaurant for special events. Daniel would probably remember him too. Here's how tonight is going to progress, Denise said once the murmurs died down. We'll enter through our own private entrance to avoid getting separated in the crowds. We will be entering the Beacon and Charles residence where your evening will take place. Ethan's eyes got wide as he processed this information. The building, which stood at the center of the park, faced the medieval castle where all paths led. That's the brownstone, Ethan said. The one with the purple windows, Hannah said behind us. The Northanger family still owned an old brownstone townhouse next to the Boston Common. The houses there are famous for being owned by the wealthiest and oldest families in the Commonwealth, the Boston Brahmins. Some of our nation's earliest leaders were members of these families, including the Northangers. The purple windows were also a famous element of these houses, which were built in the mid-1800s. The glass, imported from Europe, was perfect when it arrived and installed in the windows. As the windows turned purple, people realized there had been an excess of manganese oxide in the glass. I knew all of this because Ethan and I had toured downtown Boston during a trip to visit my family. His version of the tour was far more interesting than the official guide's script. These were specifically created with excess manganese oxide to have the same effect over time, Ethan said, teaching me something new again. Yes, Denise said. I knew, as soon as I was told you'd be with us tonight, that you could fill in these fun details, Ethan. I was always surprised when tour guides were excited about Ethan being on tours. I always feared they would resent his aside comments about the company and family history. I now believe his childlike excitement for things was infectious. I positively adored this part of his personality. The Beacon and Charles building was inspired by the Northanger family's property in the Back Bay of Boston. The interior decor has been updated in the last few years to reflect what it looked like in the 1940s when the family still lived there full-time, Denise said, looking around the shuttle and making eye contact with different people. I had seen pictures of the space by chance. I had been hired after the project had begun, but Ethan had been sent items for the museum and had shown me pictures of both the original and the park's counterpart. I often wondered what the interior looked like now. You will have a chance to look around the rooms, don't worry, Denise said with a laugh. The cocktail hour will take place there with an open bar and some small bites to eat. Katie and Ethan picked a few of these items already, and there will be a variety of items that include vegan, no dairy, and no gluten options. Diana had enjoyed telling me what was on the menu for the evening, especially the hors d'oeuvres. There would be caviar, which would be served with a variety of other things, including oysters. I had never tasted caviar before, but I love oysters. There would also be some less expensive options, including little potato pancakes, canapés, tranches, and puffy things. She had explained that Jack's menu was heavily inspired by French food with local produce and seafood. I was looking forward to trying everything. There will be other staff members there who will share details about the house when you arrive, Denise continued. The dining room for dinner is on the 3rd floor. We have an elevator for those who would like it. There were giggles, but I was glad it was mentioned. One of my colleagues used a cane to walk, and given how much we were going to drink, I suspected people would be safer in an elevator. The dinner is 5 courses, and you will have some options based on dietary needs, Denise said. We have wine pairings for each item you pick, and it will be listed. When the meal is over, you will be allowed to continue wandering, but we will serve dessert on the balcony so you can watch the evening's fireworks. You will then be able to stay in the park all night. This is part of the package, and rides will be open for you to enjoy. You will also be able to. Will there be food through the night? Someone asked from the back. We will give you a parting gift of snacks to get you through the morning, Denise said, nodding. Don't worry. Restaurants will open early in the morning for breakfast, and our shuttle will be available at 7 a.m. for you to take back to this lot. As Denise finished her introduction, the shuttle stopped at a nondescript door. We took all our stuff with us as we left, got off, and followed Denise through the door and into the park. Would you put my tie in our bag? Ethan asked me in a low voice. I took his tie, rolled it up, and slipped it into the tote I had brought with me so we could change into more comfortable shoes for the night. Our sneakers were there, as was a change of clothes if we needed them. I took his hand and gave it a squeeze as he kissed the top of my head and put his arm around my shoulders. For a moment, I wondered what he was carrying with him tonight that would fill his pockets. I was sure it was just his wallet and his phone. Everything else was in the bag. "The two of you are annoyingly adorable," Hannah said from behind us. Neither Ethan nor I acknowledged her comment. I knew she was being facetious, and I heard Daniel laugh in the background, confirming it. We only had to walk a few feet to the brownstone in the center of the park. People looked at us as the group walked up the stairs and into the building. I considered what I would think if I watched a group of people in fancy clothes walk into this building. If I didn't work for Northanger Parks, I would never know there was anything in these buildings. I would be curious. "You should try and highlight this as a unique thing to do in the parks," I whispered to Hannah as we walked through the door. "I already talked to Denise about it while we were waiting," Hannah said, tilting her head toward me. "I'm going to join one of the first groups of guests in a few weeks." I put up my hand for a sneaky high five. Hannah tapped her hand against mine. I liked when we were on the same page. "Would you like a gin, Ricky?" a waiting staff member asked. She was holding a tray of cocktails. Hannah and I toasted our glasses and walked into the main room. The style of the space looked formal but comfortable. The upholstery on the chairs and sofas looked expensive but inviting. There was a bar topped with a marble counter, and caviar trays were placed on it. I could see Ethan dipping a spoon into the bowl to try some. I had to giggle after he put some in his mouth and grimaced. Denise came up to talk to him, and it looked like he handed her something before she walked away. "Let's walk around," I said to him when he walked back over to me, smacking his lips to clear away the taste of the caviar. "As you walk around," Denise said, "look for buttons that tell you to push. Surprises are waiting for you. Please feel free to take pictures and post them on social media. Wi-Fi passwords and hashtags are printed around the house." Ethan raised his eyebrows and took my hand. I let him lead me around from room to room as we looked for these particular buttons. I found one in a massive bathroom that made the lights fade and light up the ceiling to reveal constellations of Northanger characters. Another made all the clocks in the house reveal shadows of famous characters behind the clock face while playing a song from the movie or show. Each bedroom was themed to a Northanger movie with items from the family's Boston home that had inspired Gilbert Northanger to start his animations. "I always wondered how he came up with his original ideas," one of Daniel's colleagues said while in a room with us. I gave Ethan a nudge. "Most started as stories for his kids, made up from their toys," my boyfriend said, pointing out the original toy versions of Charlie the Cat and Willow the Unicorn. "They were the kids' toys?" someone else asked. Ethan and I nodded. "This space is part of the family's museums because they include items from Gilbert's home," Ethan said. I enjoyed seeing the stained glass embedded into windows and doors, some only visible when in the house. There was one of Queen Mob that I wished I could buy for my dream home. "No," Ethan said as he watched me step into a tub so I could get a better look at that same piece. I sighed and let him help me out of the tub again. We continued to walk around for over an hour, taking drinks and hors d'oeuvres as they were offered to us. We eventually made our way out to the second-floor balcony to see and wave to people in the park. I needed to sit down, the alcohol making me feel lightheaded. Daniel brought snacks over and sat down with us. "This place is amazing," he said, handing me a plate of veggies, bread, and cheese. "Diana had a great time developing this," I said after I swallowed some bread. Hannah walked out to the balcony soon after we did. "It's time to go up to dinner," she said as she gestured us into the house. She had a goofy smile on her face that made it clear she was already drunk too. Ethan took my hand and helped me as we walked up to the third-floor dining room. The room was a beautiful formal dining room. The wall was covered in paintings of Boston during the 1920s. Each person had an assigned seat, an envelope on top of the plate. Each envelope had been hand-lettered and sealed with wax that featured Willow, the unicorn's profile. I carefully removed the seal and opened an embroidered menu on thick cardstock. The menu was folded into thirds, and the middle panel was an illustration of the Boston Common swan boats. Each course had 3 options based on dietary restrictions and included wine or drink selections. Food came out quickly, with the drinks coming right after. I watched as people took pictures, including Hannah, who also made short videos explaining what she was eating. I was confident that her personal followers alone would generate plenty of business for this team. Ethan and I were more interested in enjoying the food. We let Hannah include us in her videos through the dinner. Ethan's presence on her personal social media profiles kept her followers happy. My presence didn't always have the same effect. The menu included expensive items like white and black truffles, Wagyu beef, foie gras, Iranian pistachios, and abalone. The produce was heavily influenced by local ingredients like asparagus and avocado. Pickles, locally made, were included, and I kept snacking on them between courses. I was overwhelmed by the choices, wanting to taste it all and going as far as picking off Ethan, Daniel, and Hannah's plates. If Dora and Melissa had been sitting closer to me, I probably would have done the same to them. "I can't wait for dessert," Dora said a little louder than necessary, but we all agreed. "We'll get to dessert after the fireworks show," Denise said as the staff cleared the table. "Since you are one of our test groups, you have a chance to meet our guest chef, Jack Dreyfus." I recognized Jack Dreyfus as soon as he walked out. He shook hands as he walked around the room, everyone in the group praising his meal. "I've eaten at your restaurant in Boston many times," I said when he got around to me. This meal felt familiar and unique at the same time. "Thank you," Jack said. "I hope you get a chance to come back to Boston to eat again." "I think that's pretty likely," Daniel said with a laugh. Before we got up from the table, he brought out the rest of the kitchen staff, and we applauded their work before getting up and going down to the second-floor balcony. In the few hours of our meal, the sun had set, and it was dark. We could see people in their spots for the fireworks. I couldn't help but think of the first time I had been in this park with Ethan and on that disastrous night when I first kissed him. We had more than made up for it over the last year, but the memory always came to me when we were in the park. A moment of anxiety would still pass through me. Ethan came up next to me and pulled me close to him. I lifted my face and gave him a smile, allowing him to kiss me. He knew what I was thinking about, and he knew how to make that anxiety fade. I let him lead me to a seat at a table for 2. "The fireworks will begin shortly," Denise said, the staff following her out with cocktails and our desserts. "We will give you a treat by having part of our dessert on the balcony while enjoying the fireworks. Then we'll go back inside for a little something special before we release you to enjoy the park for the evening." Everyone clapped again. Melissa and Dora joined our table for 4, and we toasted to one of the most exciting nights we'd ever had in our lives. I loved some of the perks of working for Northanger Parks. We looked over the dessert tray and found various fresh macarons, chocolates, truffles, and fruit on a tiered tray. This was followed by individual hot fudge sundaes topped with edible gold and other expensive things I couldn't identify. I was pretty sure there was caviar on it, and I was sure the ice cream was made with an expensive vanilla bean. As we ate, the fireworks show began, and coffee was served. Ethan and I held hands as we watched the show. I was happily drunk and full. "We should ride microverse all night," Ethan said, clearly drunk as well. I could hear everyone around us groan at the idea. There was something creepy about that ride during the day. There was no way I would ride it all night, those dolls dancing and singing in a nearly empty ride. "Lightning coaster," Dora called out, and people in our group groaned. "No," Melissa said for us all, shaking her head. "I don't want to be sick given how much is in my stomach." Dora pouted for a moment. "Don't worry," I said, "we'll be able to get on it after a few hours." That made Dora perk up again. "Thank you for watching our show," the announcer said when the fireworks were over. "Please exit the park and enjoy the rest of your night." We all sat a bit longer, many of us needing a moment to get up and feel steady on our feet. We watched as the park guests reluctantly departed. Everyone in our group took the elevator up one floor. We had been drinking so much that I was afraid people might fall down the stairs and hurt themselves. Since it only held a few people, Ethan and I arrived last. Denise handed us each one last glass of champagne. I walked back to my seat and found a bag with my name on it. Inside was a lovely pin that all guests would get, snacks to eat through the night, a voucher for breakfast, and a Beacon and Charles wristband. "These bands are yours to use tonight," Denise told us. "They are synced with your accounts already, so feel free to use them the next time you come back for a pleasure trip." I put down my glass and put my wristband on. "There's just one last thing we want to do tonight," Denise said, and a smile spread across her face as she turned to Ethan. I turned to my boyfriend and watched him blush. "This is the most impulsive decision I've ever made," he said to me, and I could see tiny beads of sweat. Nothing about Ethan was impulsive. That was me. It's why we met, why we fell in love, and why we were here tonight. There was only one decision I could ever imagine Ethan making. I felt tears fill my eyes because I knew what he would do before he got down on one knee and took the jewelry box out of his pocket. He took a deep breath before opening the box to reveal a beautiful Art Deco-style ring in the shape of a flower with white and blue diamonds. I wanted to just yell, "Yes." I knew what he was going to ask, and I knew this was what I wanted, but I also needed to let him ask me. "Katie Merton," Ethan said, a waver in his voice. "Will you marry me?" I thought I would yell, but I was so overwhelmed with emotion that my yes came out in a whisper. Tears spilled down my cheeks as he slipped the ring on my finger, and people applauded. Once he was on his feet again, it took him a moment before he kissed me and lifted me up. I expected him to swing me around, but that felt a little too cliché, and we might break something. Instead, we all toasted, and people wanted to see the ring. As we made our way back down the elevator, the evening over, I let him hold me in his arms. We walked outside, the park empty except for our friends and the few other people who had bought these special, all-night tickets, and moved over to the medieval castle at the center of the park. When we got there, I jumped into Ethan's arms, wrapped my arms around his neck, and kissed him. "This was the best dinner ever," I said when he put me down. "I think we can top it," Melissa said. Ethan and I turned to her, curious about how it could get better. "My new project is a redesign of the Northanger wedding events," Melissa said. Hannah jumped up and down a few times. "Yes. This will be a dream wedding." I laughed, but I didn't care. Tonight would still hold the top spot for the best dinner ever. Thank you for listening to A Little More Phi Alpha Pi, the companion story collection to Pride, Prejudice, and Pledging. If you'd like to read the audiobook, ebook, or paperback versions of the main books in the series or other related short story collections, visit my webpage for links. Like or subscribe to this YouTube channel for more audiobooks and videos.